Hey guys, welcome back to Movie Box on CIV24.com. My name's Amanda and we're going to be reviewing some more of my favorite films. Most of the films we'll be covering today are a little bit romantic, but I think that they'll favor everybody. The first film that we'll be covering is Penelope, and it's one of my most favorite movies. I could literally watch this film every day, and I did just that when I was in college. This film stars Christina Ricci and James McAvoy. Penelope is about a girl who is cursed with the face of a pig. Basically, centuries ago, a witch cursed the Wilhern family because their youngest son impregnated their daughter, and she ended up killing herself because he chose not to be with her. Now, I know that seems a little bit morbid, but it is still PG-13. Now, the only way to break this curse is if one of her own loves her. So, her mother, who's played by Catherine O'Hara, who is absolutely hilarious in this film, chooses to set her up with blue buds in the area. She hires a matchmaker to do just this. Penelope's mother and the matchmaker set her up in a way where they have suitors come into the room and she speaks to them through a one-way mirror. Now, she does this because anybody who sees her, especially men, flee at the sight of her. She thinks she likes this one guy named Edward, and so she chooses to reveal herself to him. Unfortunately, when he sees her, he runs away screaming. And Jake, their servant, usually tries to catch the men before they get too far, but this time, he got away. Edward ends up teaming up with this journalist who has been trying to get a picture of Penelope for years and has even lost an eye over it. Edward and the journalist come up with an idea to try and find a low and down out blue blood, and they end up finding Max Campion, played by James McAvoy. In this particular scene, Max enters the room with all the other men, but Penelope has been so fed up that she just chooses to reveal herself to everybody. Max doesn't actually end up seeing her because he was fidgeting with his jacket, and we come to see that he's the only one left in the room, which excites Penelope, her mother, and the matchmaker. My favorite scene in this movie, well, one of them, is when she reveals herself to him. He's playing the piano and she kind of just comes up behind him and starts playing with him. And at first, when he sees her, you'd think that he was afraid, but he was actually, I think, a little more intrigued is what it looked like, and she was clearly terrified. What ended up happening is the camera went off and she was very afraid and ran off. And he ran off too to get her. Penelope begs Max to marry her, but he can't, and we learn it's because he's not really a blue blood. I believe this movie is all about finding your way and doing things that scare you. Penelope ends up leaving her house, making friends, and her life completely changes, and that she only would have done that if she left the house.
Hi.
For who she is.
I like myself the way I
am. Christina Ricci.
The public loves this girl.
And this inspires Max. He learns to stop gambling and try to build his life back up. One of the best kissing scenes I've ever seen in a movie is this one. When Penelope and Max see each other again, it is so beautiful, and of course they end up happily ever after. This is a perfect movie to just cuddle up on the couch to, or with somebody you love. And remember, it's not the power of the curse, it's the power you give the curse. Now, I haven't seen this movie in a while, but I remember that the first time I saw it, I was about 16, and it was in the middle of the day in the summer, and while I probably should have been out playing with friends, all I wanted to do was watch a movie. I'm weird, right? This movie is called Meet Joe Black. I'm sure a lot of people haven't heard of it, and it stars Brad Pitt and Anthony Hopkins. This movie, like Penelope, involves love as well as a little bit of fantasy. In short, Death visits Anthony Hopkins' character, Mr. Parrish, and tells him that he wants to go on vacation, but was inspired by a speech Mr. Parrish had given his daughter that he chooses to stay with him. I'm sure, of course, if Death were to visit you, you wouldn't believe it was actually Death, but there was things that was happening to Mr. Parrish that actually made him believe that this was real. Death, of course, is played by Brad Pitt, and he comes to Bill Parrish's home in the middle of a family dinner that Bill is having with his two daughters and their suitors. Bill is at a loss of words when he tries to introduce Death to his family that he ends up just calling him Joe Black, thus the name of the movie. One of the funny things about this movie is that Susan, Bill's daughter, and Death have actually met before, something that Death didn't even know himself. The thing is, Joe Black had actually needed a body to take, so we took this boy's body that Susan had met at the diner earlier that day. They really hit it off, so when she met him and he didn't remember her, she was a little hurt. Through this film, Joe ends up falling in love with Susan, Bill's daughter, and I really felt that Brad Pitt was a really good actor in this film because he had to be so still most of the time. He really had to pretend that he was like a child. He didn't know how to eat, he didn't know how to dress, and he didn't know the normalcies in this world. Of course, Bill isn't blind and he sees that Joe and Susan are beginning to fall in love. And when Bill's time is over and Death wants to go back home, he tells Bill that he's taking Susan with him, which is obviously so scary. I actually learned a lot about love through this film. There's many great quotes, and one of the best ones is what he tells Joe, that love is about sacrifice and learning to let people live their own life. So this movie doesn't necessarily have the happiest ending. Bill ends up leaving with Death, which means that he dies, and Death chooses to leave Susan, which obviously makes her heartbroken, but his body does end up coming back, so it's not entirely bad if you look like Brad Pitt. The score of this movie was also fantastic. The ending of the movie, the song that plays is It's a Wonderful World and Somewhere Over the Rainbow. It became one of my favorites and I couldn't stop listening to it for a week. This film is a little lengthy. I mean, it does take up 2 VHS tapes, but how movies are today, they're always pretty long. Aside from watching a lot of movies, I also love reading, and one of my favorite books is The Perks of Being a Wallflower. This is one of the books that I actually have read way more than once. Naturally, when I found out that they were making this book into a film, I was so ecstatic. Of course, there was the worry that it wouldn't be as good, but the writer and the director of the film was actually the one who wrote the book. So it was pretty accurate, probably one of the most accurate movies from a book I have ever seen. This film stars Logan Lerman, Emma Watson, and Ezra Miller. This film stars Charlie, a freshman in high school who is a loner and has absolutely no friends. The year before, his only best friend ended up committing suicide. The only friend that Charlie makes on the first day of school is a teacher who ends up becoming his mentor. One of the most heartbreaking things about this film is how hard Charlie actually tries to make friends. I mean, he goes to social events, he goes to football games, and he goes to dances, all by himself. At one of the football games, Charlie sees a familiar face from class, a boy named Patrick. Patrick is a senior and is retaking a shop class. Charlie says hi to Patrick, and Patrick welcomes Charlie to come sit with him. And soon after we meet Sam, Patrick's stepsister, who Charlie ends up falling in love with.
So Charlie?
One of the best things about the book was the surprise ending and the build up to it. And what I didn't realize after watching the film is how prominent mental illness is. Charlie's just the type of boy who's very sensitive and allows his emotions to overcome him. All he wants to do is make sure everyone is happy. After their first meeting, Patrick and Sam take Charlie for a ride through the tunnel, and it is at this moment that Charlie turns to Patrick and says, "I feel infinite." One of the best lines in the film, in the book, and probably in history. This is definitely a coming-of-age story, but none like I've ever seen before.
So what are you gonna do when you get out of this place?
I really want to be a writer, but I don't know what I'd write about.
You could write about us.
Call it Slut and the Falcon. Make us solve crimes.
Like I said, the ending of the book was very intense and emotional, and I was very curious to see how that would play out on screen, and it played so amazingly that from the beginning of the breakdown to the very end of the film, I could not stop crying.
I know there are people who say all these things don't happen. I know these will all be stories someday. But right now, we are alive. And in this moment, I swear, we are infinite.
The Perks of Being a Wallflower has a fantastic cast, great music, and a perfect script. And I know I say this a lot, but this is definitely one of my favorite top 3 movies. Well, that's it for this episode of Movie Box. You can catch us at www.cib24.com, and you're welcome to follow us on social networks as well as Twitter and Facebook.